Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to go deep on something that really shook India and the world back in 2012.
Yeah.
It's the Delhi gang rape and murder.
Often called the Nirbhaya case.
Often called the Nirbhaya case, yeah.
It's a case that kind of sparked global outrage and led to some pretty significant changes to the legal system in India.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're gonna break all that down for you.
Yeah.
We've got two sources for this deep dive.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from the Wikipedia article to give us a solid overview of the case.
Uh-huh.
And we've got this really fascinating profile of Justice Bhanumathi from the Supreme Court Observer.
Oh, wow.
Now, she was one of the judges that upheld the death sentences in this case.
Interesting.
And her perspective is really unique because she wasn't just looking at the law. She was looking at the whole societal context surrounding this crime.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's start with the basics. What happened that night in December 2012?
Okay.
I mean, the details are tough to hear, but I think it's important to understand just how horrific this crime was.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the victim was a 22-year-old physiotherapy intern.
Okay.
Her name was Jyoti Singh.
Okay.
She and a male friend were on their way home, and they were tricked into getting onto a private bus. And that's when the nightmare began.
Oh, gosh.
On that bus, they were both brutally beaten. Jyoti was gang raped and tortured with an iron rod.
Oh, my goodness.
And then they were just dumped on the side of the road.
It's just unimaginable.
Really is.
Yeah.
And Jyoti fought for her life for 13 days.
Wow.
She was treated in Delhi first, and then they flew her to Singapore for specialized care, but tragically she died from her injuries.
It's so incredibly sad. And you mentioned her name, Jyoti Singh. Now, her parents actually chose to share her real name with the world.
They did.
Which was very unusual because Indian law usually protects the identities of rape victims.
Yeah, it was a deliberate and powerful decision.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted the world to know their daughter's name.
Yeah.
And to remember her for her courage. I think they felt that naming her, you know, helped break the stigma surrounding rape in India, and it kind of gave her back her identity.
Yeah.
She wasn't just a nameless victim.
And it seems like it really resonated with people.
It did.
That idea of, taking back control of the narrative.
Absolutely. And her parents really hoped it would empower other survivors to come forward and speak out as well.
Yeah, now there were 6 men involved in this attack.
Yes.
What happened to them legally?
6 men. Yeah, the public outcry after what happened to Jyoti was just immense.
I can imagine.
It put a lot of pressure on authorities to act swiftly.
Yeah.
So the investigation and the trials moved very quickly. 4 of the adult perpetrators were sentenced to death.
Okay.
Although the executions didn't actually happen until 2020.
Interesting that there was such a gap.
Yeah, it speaks to the kind of complexities of the Indian legal system.
Yeah.
You know, all the appeals that are possible in death penalty cases.
Right.
And then there's the youngest perpetrator. He was tried as a juvenile.
Okay.
Ended up serving the maximum sentence allowed, which was 3 years.
Okay.
A lot of people felt that that wasn't really enough, given the brutality of the crime.
Yeah, I can see how that would be very controversial.
Exactly.
Especially, given how heinous this was.
There was a big debate about whether juveniles should be tried as adults in cases like this.
Right.
And then sadly, one of the perpetrators actually died in prison.
Wow.
Probably by suicide before his trial even began.
And reading through the Wikipedia article,
Yeah.
one thing that really struck me was that one of the perpetrators actually blamed Jyoti for the attack.
I know. It's just...
almost impossible to comprehend that kind of thinking.
It's a chilling example of victim blaming.
Yeah.
You know, it's this insidious tendency to shift the responsibility for a crime onto the victim.
So it's not just about one perpetrator's, messed up logic. It's pointing to something bigger.
Exactly. It reveals, deep-seated societal issues.
Right.
Especially when it comes to attitudes towards women. It's this idea that a woman's actions can justify or excuse violence against her.
Right.
But the reality is no one is ever responsible for their own assault.
Yeah.
The blame always lies solely with the perpetrator.
You can definitely see how a statement like that on top of everything else would further fuel the outrage and the anger.
Absolutely. And this case sparked just massive protests all over India.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about small demonstrations here. Millions of people took to the streets.
Wow.
Cutting across, social and economic lines.
Yeah.
It was a really powerful expression of collective anger and grief, but also this deep desire for change. They wanted justice for Jyoti,
right,
but they were also demanding accountability from the government and real systemic change.
And what was it about this case, do you think, that made it such a catalyst?
That's a good question.
I mean, sadly, violence against women is a global issue, but the Nirbhaya case seemed to hit a nerve in a very specific way in India.
Yeah, I mean, the brutality of the crime itself was definitely a factor. The details of the torture that Jyoti endured.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that she was a young woman with her whole life ahead of her.
Right.
It all just struck a chord.
Yeah.
And then you have the perpetrator's attitude, you know, their complete lack of remorse.
Yeah.
That victim-blaming statement, it just added fuel to the fire.
Yeah.
I think for many Indians, this case felt like a breaking point.
Okay.
It brought to the surface a lot of simmering frustrations and
Yeah.
anxieties about women's safety in India.
So it wasn't just a reaction to this one horrific event. It was kind of a culmination of a lot of pent-up anger and fear.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it, yeah.
Now, you mentioned that we have this profile of Justice Benumathe,
We do.
one of the judges who upheld the death sentences in this case.
Right.
What's so interesting about her perspective?
Well, she was part of the panel of judges that ultimately agreed that the death penalty was warranted in this case.
Right.
But she wrote a separate concurring opinion,
Okay.
and that's where things get interesting. She didn't just focus on the legal aspects of the crime
Right.
or the evidence presented. She went deeper.
Okay.
You know, she wrote about the wider societal context, the deeply ingrained misogyny that makes a crime like this possible.
Yeah.
And she really pushed for these broader changes to achieve genuine gender justice in India.
So she was using her platform to address more than just the legal technicalities.
Exactly.
She was calling for a societal shift.
Yeah, and it wasn't just with this case.
that's
You know,
right.
if you look at her work on other cases, you see this consistent pattern of thoroughness, independence, and a willingness to dissent when she felt it was necessary.
Wow.
She was a strong advocate for justice, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind.
Okay, before we move on to the actual legal reforms that came after this case,
Okay.
I want to pause for a moment and just ask, what stands out to you most about this case so far? Is it the legal side, the societal impact, Jyoti's parents speaking out?
Honestly, for me, it's the scale of the protests.
Yeah.
Millions of people pouring into the streets, unified in their outrage and this demand for justice. It's just a powerful example of how a single tragic event can become a catalyst for a much larger movement, a real call for systemic change.
Yeah, what about you?
What gets you?
What gets me is Jyoti's parents.
Yeah.
Their decision to share her name. It was such a personal and courageous act. I can only imagine how difficult that must have been.
Yeah.
But it clearly had these profound implications, not just in India, but around the world.
Oh, you're so right. It's hard to overstate the impact of that decision.
Yeah.
It really galvanized the nation and changed the conversation around sexual assault.
So this massive public outcry, I mean, it really put a lot of pressure on the government to take action and actually change the laws.
Yeah, they really had to respond. I mean,
Right.
the sheer force of public opinion was just undeniable.
Yeah.
So one of the major changes was the establishment of these fast-track courts,
Okay.
specifically to deal with rape cases. They realized that the legal system was just too slow.
Right.
You know, these cases could drag on for years and years,
Yeah.
leaving the victims and their families just in limbo waiting for justice.
So they streamlined the process, trying to make it more efficient and responsive?
Right. And alongside that, they also introduced much stricter punishments
Okay.
for sexual assault.
Okay.
In some cases, the death penalty was now an option,
Wow.
which was a huge change from the previous sentencing guidelines.
So they were sending a message that these crimes would be taken much more seriously.
Exactly.
And I understand there was also a special fund set up, the Nirbhaya Fund.
Right.
What was its purpose?
Yeah, so the Nirbhaya Fund was designed to improve women's safety and security across India.
Okay.
It was meant to fund a whole range of initiatives from things like, you know, better street lighting, more police patrols in high-risk areas,
Okay.
to, you know, self-defense programs for women and support services for survivors of assault.
That sounds like a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But did these changes actually make a difference?
Right.
I mean, is it safer to be a woman in India today because of these reforms?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no simple answer.
Right.
It's like trying to change the course of a giant ship. You know, you can adjust the rudder,
Yeah.
but it takes time and sustained effort to really see a difference in direction.
So are you saying that the laws themselves can only go so far?
Exactly. It's like building a house. The laws are the foundation,
Right.
but you need the walls, the roof, the whole structure
Yeah.
to create a safe and secure space.
Yeah.
And in this case, that means tackling things like victim blaming, gender inequality,
Right.
and this lack of support for women who come forward.
So how do you actually go about changing those things? I mean, it seems like such a monumental task.
It's definitely not easy.
Yeah.
But I think education is key.
Right.
We need to be teaching young people, boys and girls, about consent, respect, healthy relationships. We need to challenge those harmful stereotypes and beliefs about gender roles that are just so deeply ingrained in the culture.
It's about shifting the mindset of an entire society.
And that takes time.
Right.
And it takes a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Alongside education, you need to have consistent enforcement of the laws.
Right.
If perpetrators aren't held accountable,
Yeah.
it sends the message that these crimes aren't really taken seriously.
Right.
And that can undermine the whole effort.
So accountability and consequences are crucial.
Absolutely. And we need to empower women.
Okay.
That means giving them the resources and support they need to come forward
Yeah.
if they've been assaulted.
Right.
Without fear of judgment or stigma,
Yeah.
it means creating a system where they feel believed and supported, not re-victimized.
But even with all these efforts,
Yeah.
hasn't there actually been an increase in reported rapes in India since the Nirbhaya case?
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
And it's a complex issue to unpack, It's hard to know for sure whether there are actually more incidents of sexual violence occurring or if it's just that women are more willing to report them now.
So it could actually be a sign that things are moving in the right direction, at least in terms of awareness and empowerment.
It's possible, but let's not sugarcoat it.
Right.
There's still a huge backlog of cases in the courts. Victim blaming remains a massive problem.
Yeah.
And many women still live in fear.
Yeah.
The fact is, a lot of these deep-rooted societal issues haven't been fully addressed yet, and that's the real challenge.
Right.
How to create lasting, meaningful change in a society that, frankly, has a long way to go when it comes to gender equality.
It sounds like you're saying there have been some positive steps, but the journey is far from over.
That's a good way to put it. The Nirbhaya case was a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It forced India to confront some very uncomfortable truths about itself.
Right.
But true progress requires this sustained, multifaceted effort
Right.
and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
So where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this story?
Well, if we look at Justice Banamothi's concurring opinion, I think we find a roadmap for the future.
Okay.
She really pushed for broader societal change as being essential
Right.
for achieving gender justice.
And how do we translate that into concrete action?
It's about changing hearts and minds, one person at a time.
Okay.
It's about raising awareness, challenging harmful attitudes, and supporting organizations that are working on the ground
Right.
to empower women and create a safer, more equitable society.
Okay, but that sounds very idealistic. How do we measure real change? How do we know if these efforts are actually making a difference?
It's not always easy to quantify,
Right.
but I think we can look at some key indicators. For example, are more women coming forward to report assaults?
Okay.
Are conviction rates going up?
Right.
Is the justice system becoming more responsive and sensitive to the needs of victims? And beyond the legal realm, are we seeing a shift in attitudes and behaviors?
Right.
Are women feeling safer and more empowered in their daily lives?
Yeah.
These are the kinds of questions we need to be asking if we want to gauge real progress.
So it's about looking at the whole picture, not just the legal side of things.
Exactly.
And speaking of the bigger picture, this case resonated far beyond India's borders, didn't it?
It did.
I mean, it sparked conversations and even protests around the world.
Yeah.
Why do you think Jyoti's story had such a global impact?
It's a powerful story. It's
Yeah.
a story about a young woman with dreams and aspirations
Right.
whose life was just brutally cut short.
Yeah.
It's a story about injustice
Aye.
and the fight for equality.
Right.
And I think it resonated with people globally because, sadly, it's a story that's all too familiar.
You're saying it touched a nerve because it reflects a universal struggle?
Exactly. Violence against women is a global pandemic.
Yeah.
It transcends borders, cultures, socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think Jyoti's story gave a human face to this issue.
Yeah.
It forced people to confront the reality of this violence and to ask themselves, what can we do to stop this from happening again?
And what did that global response look like? Did it translate into any concrete actions or changes in other countries?
Definitely, the Nirbhaya case sparked a wave of activism and advocacy.
Okay.
Around the world, there were protests and demonstrations in solidarity with the protests happening in India.
So it was like a ripple effect spreading outward.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about showing support. It was about demanding change in their own countries.
Right.
You know, people were sharing stories, raising awareness, and pushing for stronger laws and policies to protect women.
Yeah.
It really felt like a global movement was taking shape.
And did that momentum lead to any tangible changes?
There were definitely some significant developments.
Okay.
For example, in some countries, the case sparked renewed calls for tougher sentencing for sexual assault crimes. There was also a lot of discussion about how to improve support systems for victims, how to make the legal process less daunting, and how to tackle the root causes of gender-based violence, like toxic masculinity and gender inequality.
So it wasn't just about reacting to the horror of this one case, but about using it as a springboard for broader systemic change.
That's exactly right. And I think that's one of the most important legacies of the Nirbhaya case. It brought this issue to the forefront of global consciousness and created this sense of urgency that we need to do better, that we can't just sit back and let this violence continue.
It sounds like Jyoti's story, in a way, became a catalyst for a global conversation about violence against women.
It did, and it's a conversation that needs to continue.
Yeah.
We can't let this issue just fade from the headlines.
Right.
We have to keep talking about it, keep pushing for change, and keep holding our leaders accountable.
And on that note, I think it's important to acknowledge that even though the Nirbhaya case happened over a decade ago, it's still a very raw and painful topic for many people.
Absolutely.
And it's a reminder that the fight for gender justice is far from over.
It's not.
There's still so much work to be done.
There is.
And in a way, Jyoti's story has become a symbol of that fight.
I think so.
You know, her parents' decision to share her name, the protests that erupted in her memory, the legal reforms that followed, it all speaks to the power of collective action and the enduring hope for a better future.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. You know, her story, tragic as it is, has become this beacon of hope.
Right.
A reminder that change is possible.
Yeah.
And that even in the face of such immense darkness, the human spirit can find the strength to fight for justice and equality.
And you mentioned that the Wikipedia article lists a number of artistic responses to the Nirbhaya case.
It does.
Documentaries, films, even literary works. It seems like her story has resonated deeply with artists, inspiring them to grapple with these complex issues through their work.
Absolutely. That's another important part of Jyoti's legacy.
Yeah.
How her story has ignited the imaginations of artists and spurred them to create these powerful works that explore the many facets of this tragedy.
All right.
And its aftermath, you know, each of these artistic interpretations offers a unique perspective, a different way of processing the pain, the anger, the hope that this case evokes.
And those artistic responses, in a way, help to keep the conversation going.
Yeah.
They invite us to engage with these difficult issues on a deeper level, beyond the headlines and the legal proceedings.
Exactly. They challenge us to think critically, to feel deeply, and to imagine a world where such a tragedy would never again be possible.
So for our listeners who are feeling overwhelmed or even hopeless after hearing about this case, we encourage you to explore these artistic responses. They offer a powerful way to connect with Jyoti's story and to find solace, inspiration, and maybe even a renewed sense of purpose in the ongoing fight for justice and equality.
It's like they're taking Jyoti's story and turning it into something that can spark dialogue and maybe even lead to tangible change.
That's the power of art, isn't it? It can make us feel things, think differently, see the world with new eyes.
Absolutely.
And speaking of seeing things from different perspectives, it's easy to focus on Jyoti's family and their unimaginable loss.
Of course.
But this case impacted so many lives. What about the families of the perpetrators?
That's an aspect we don't often think about. I remember reading some articles, especially around the time of the executions in 2020, that gave glimpses into the lives of those families, and it was a stark reminder that there are human beings on all sides of a story like this. And the ripple effects of this tragedy were felt far and wide.
It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage and the desire for justice. And, of course, that's completely understandable. But you're right. It's important to remember the human element for everyone involved.
It challenges us to hold those competing emotions. The anger at the perpetrators, the sympathy for the victims, and even the empathy for those caught in the crossfire. It's a reminder that even in the face of such horrific acts, there's still a need for compassion and understanding.
It's a complex and nuanced situation, for sure. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to something you touched on earlier, the global response to this case. We talked about how it sparked protests and conversations worldwide. Did it also lead to any specific changes or initiatives on an international level?
It really, the Nirbhaya case brought a lot of attention to the issue of violence against women. And it pushed governments and international organizations to take concrete action. For example, the United Nations launched a global initiative called Unite to End Violence Against Women.
Wow.
It aims to raise awareness, strengthen advocacy, and promote partnerships to prevent and address violence against women and girls around the world.
So it seems like Jyoti's case acted as a kind of catalyst for a more coordinated global response to this issue.
That's a good way to put it. It galvanized efforts and resources on a scale that hadn't really been seen before.
Wow.
There was this sense of urgency, a recognition that we need to move beyond just words and actually take concrete steps to create a world where women and girls are safe from violence.
It's been really eye-opening to delve into this case with you today.
It has.
It's a story filled with so much pain and darkness. But also with incredible courage and resilience.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, I think it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does. I think one of the most important takeaways for me is the power of collective action. Those protests that erupted after Jyoti's death? They were a testament to the fact that people can come together.
And demand change. And that those demands can have a real impact.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless. That even in the face of such horrific tragedies, we can still find the strength to fight for a better world.
Absolutely. And we can honor Jyoti's memory by continuing to push for justice, equality, and an end to violence against women, not just in India, but everywhere.
So, to our listeners, we leave you with this thought. How will you carry forward the torch of Jyoti's legacy? What will you do to contribute to a world where such tragedies are no longer possible?
It's a good question.
It can be something big or something small, but every act of courage, every voice raised against injustice brings us one step closer to that goal.
Let's each do our part to create a world where every woman and girl can live with dignity, safety, and freedom.
It's like they're taking Jyoti's story and turning it into something that can spark dialogue and maybe even lead to tangible change.
That's the power of art, isn't it? It can make us feel things, think differently, see the world with new eyes. And speaking of seeing things from different perspectives, it's easy to focus on Jyoti's family and their unimaginable loss. But this case impacted so many lives. What about the families of the perpetrators?
That's an aspect we don't often think about. I remember reading some articles, especially around the time of the executions in 2020. That gave glimpses into the lives of those families. And it was a stark reminder that there are human beings on all sides of a story like this. And the ripple effects of this tragedy were felt far and wide.
It's so easy to get caught up in the outrage and the desire for justice.
Of course.
And of course, that's completely understandable. But you're right, it's important to remember the human element for everyone involved.
It challenges us to hold those competing emotions, the anger at the perpetrators, the sympathy for the victims, and even the empathy for those caught in the crossfire. It's a reminder that even in the face of such horrific acts, there's still a need for compassion and understanding.
It's a complex and nuanced situation for sure. Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to something you touched on earlier, the global response to this case. We talked about how it sparked protests and conversations worldwide. Did it also lead to any specific changes or initiatives on an international level?
It really did. The Nirbhaya case brought a lot of attention to the issue of violence against women, and it really pushed governments and international organizations to take concrete action, like, for example, the United Nations. They launched this global initiative called Unite to End Violence Against Women. And it aims to raise awareness, strengthen advocacy, and promote partnerships to prevent and address violence against women and girls all over the world.
So it seems like Jyoti's case acted as a kind of catalyst for a more coordinated global response to this issue.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It galvanized efforts and resources on a scale that we hadn't really seen before.
Right.
There was this sense of urgency, this recognition that we need to move beyond just words and actually take concrete steps to create a world where women and girls are safe from violence.
Well, it's been really eye-opening to delve into this case with you today.
Yeah, it has been.
It's a story filled with so much pain and darkness, but also with incredible courage and resilience. And ultimately, I think it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
It does. I think one of the most important takeaways for me is the power of collective action. Those protests that erupted after Jyoti's death, they were a testament to the fact that people can come together and demand change, and that those demands can have a real impact.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless, that even in the face of such horrific tragedies, we can still find the strength to fight for a better world.
Absolutely. And we can honor Jyoti's memory by continuing to push for justice, equality, and an end to violence against women, not just in India, but everywhere.
So to our listeners, we leave you with this thought. How will you carry forward the torch of Jyoti's legacy? What will you do to contribute to a world where such tragedies are no longer possible?
It's a good question to think about.
It can be something big or something small, but every act of courage, every voice raised against injustice brings us one step closer to that goal.
Let's each do our part to create a world where every woman and girl can live with dignity, safety, and freedom.